Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Charles Sabansu, and welcome you guys to another episode of the DREAMERSPRO show. We cover everything from sports, hot topics, classic debates, entertainment, and we give you guys a fresh perspective on things and how we see them. And today we have a hell of a show in store for you guys. Before we get into it, please make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, as you guys know, we live in a pretty interesting time in terms of sports media. Pretty interesting time. In the past, the way we would get our news is the way that we used to, through newspapers, and various publications, and of course on television by a select few broadcasters, analysts, etc. But with the advent of social media and various media platforms, we now have a situation where we get our news from a range of voices. You get them from the legacy guys that you see on ESPN, Fox Sports, and all of them, ABC. You get your news from them. Then you get news from independent guys like myself and others, and now you also get news from former athletes, podcasters, who there seems to be an athlete starting a podcast every single day. The latest one I know of is the Dwight Howard podcast. Everybody wants to have, a podcast, right? And to me, I don't see anything wrong with former athletes having podcasts. I don't see that. I don't see an issue with it personally. I think it begins to get a little dicey when you have active athletes who have podcasts, right? And you know, one of them, I give you an example, is Paul George, right? Paul George, who used to play with the Clippers. Not even Paul George. Before Paul George, it was even Draymond Green, right? I remember Draymond Green's podcast really kicked off because he was like going through the playoffs. I even think at one point he was in the finals or something like that, but for sure he was in the playoffs. And then after the game, he would go do a podcast and give you guys a blow by blow, right? And that was the first time we had seen anything where a player who was playing in the playoffs could turn around later that night and then go do a podcast and give fans an insight to what they just saw in the game, right? That was pretty unique. And then other players started following in his footsteps. But one of the people that has been critical of player podcasts, and it's not just him, others have been as well, but one of those people has been Nick Wright. Nick Wright is not a fan of these player podcasts. He really doesn't think he thinks most of them aren't really good at all. And recently I came across a segment from First Things First with himself and Chris Broussard, Kevin Wiles, and they were discussing the pitfalls of having a podcast as an active player. And I thought that he made some pretty interesting points. Obviously, he did it with humor. So what we want to do is play exactly what Nick Wright had to say on FS1 about players with podcasts, and then we're going to come back and continue on the show. Take a listen to Nick right here.
Today, we look outwards to the player podcast world. Player podcasts are under duress, and to misquote a former president, I'm calling for a complete and full shutdown until we figure out what's going on. Because I know what's happened. People saw, you see, this player started a podcast, and that's how he connected with Taylor Swift. What could it do for me? Here's the answer. Not that, America. What it's going to do for you is cause dissension and disaster. Let's go through a short list. Debo starts a podcast on episode 1. Gets himself on the board. Pat Bev starts a podcast, episode 1 through infinity, makes a fool of himself. Micah starts a podcast, raises coach's blood pressure, causes problems in the locker rooms. Michael Porter Jr. starts a podcast. Hey, don't listen to that. Certainly not at work. LeBron starts a podcast. The Lakers hire the co-host to be his head coach. The Knicks guys start a podcast called The Roommates Pod. Don't invite Julius Randle in. Now he's Instagramming, the truth will come out. And now it's impacting games. Here's CJ Stroud talking to Bears Jalen Johnson about a podcast that Jalen did, that Caleb listened to, that helped the Texans beat the Bears.
Stop telling your secrets on Richard Sherman podcast, dude.
What you mean?
The palms look. You ain't slick, brother. You ain't getting me. You ain't getting me.
Coach, he went on the podcast. He said this is what we do. CJ watched it. They then played, and he knew.
I like CJ more now than before. I love that he's listening to podcasts.
No, it's a great job by him, and everything CJ does makes him more likable and makes him seem smarter, all of it, including the fact he doesn't have a podcast. He goes on other people sometimes,
yeah.
he listens to them, and he uses them. Folks, you're not going to get Dua Lipa to marry you. by doing a podcast. Just chill out and let's just figure out what's happening here.
Can I give Nick like an A+?
I was going, yes. And you give him an A+, Nick. This is definitely your best ombudsman segment for sure. You know, Coach and I are in agreement with you. You just think about it. You got 45 minutes to an hour to kill. You're going to say something you don't mean to say. You're going to give out some secrets that you're not supposed to. You're going to say something about an opponent that you're not supposed to, whether too good or too bad. And so it's tough, man.
More editors.
Well, it's almost like everyone is like, all right, I got a host, check. I got the former player, check. Cameras, mics, we good? Like, we're good.
Go.
You need a real editor. Just be like, hey, take that part out. You've been playing C.J. Stroud.
The thing is, if you take out the good stuff, it's not going to be a great podcast.
It doesn't matter.
It's just hard for players
You can take out the strategy like that. You can take out that.
But that's what people want.
So you heard what Nick Wright had to say. Here are my thoughts on this. As I said, I have a few thoughts. I'm not really a fan of it. I'm really not. And I'm going to speak from the standpoint of a fan, right? Let's look at the Paul George situation. There was a point last year where the Clippers were making a push to the playoffs, and then Paul George got injured a few weeks before the playoffs, like maybe a month or so before the playoffs. And a lot of Clipper fans were gutted by that news. So given the high expectations on the Clippers that season and everything they had invested into that team, it was kind of a make or break it year for the team. So when Paul George went down, it was a very, very deflating moment. And anytime we search news on the team or him, you were just hoping for good news. Maybe he's making progress with his rehab, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And to me, this is just me, it didn't sit well with me that, okay, here's a guy that we really want on the court, and he is rehabilitating, but then I see him on a podcast talking sports and talking all this. And to me, it just didn't sit well. Now, some people didn't see an issue with it. I personally didn't like it at a moment like that. I don't want to hear your thoughts on what's going on around the NBA. It would be better if you just kind of stayed away and just focused on what it is that you're doing. So it didn't sit well with me, right? But then you have other players who I think have systemized their life so well that even if they do a podcast, they can kind of pull it off. But I think very few can do it. A person that I do think does it well, at least for the time that he did it, was LeBron. But LeBron is such a regimented player. I mean, LeBron, we know that where, there've been stories of him. He goes into dark mode when he turns off his phone, no communication. LeBron really locks into what he's doing. So I think a person like LeBron James can better maneuver the world of this laser-like focus on, for instance, a playoff run or NBA season, and then still carve out moments in time to do podcasts. The fundamental difference with LeBron's podcast and other podcasts is this, and people don't realize it. The difference is this. If you look at other podcasters, Paul George, Draymond Green, I'm talking about active players that have podcasts. In the case of Draymond does his own show, right? So Draymond does his show predominantly. He's reacting to news and things happening around his team. So the work that goes into that is, you got to do more work, right? Because you have to be more dialed in with the information and research a little bit. Paul George does something different than Draymond. Paul George has two companions that he does the show with, but then Paul George also interviews guests. Whenever you interview people, you now have to do research and all that. So you have to spend time doing that. That could probably take away from your focus, take away from things you could be doing. But in the case of LeBron, it's something different. LeBron, on his podcast, gets interviewed by JJ Redick, at the time at least. LeBron is not the one doing the research. LeBron is the one being asked questions that he now responds to. LeBron doesn't come in there with, a set of questions for JJ. No. JJ's asking him the questions, then he responds, and he may throw a question back at him, but it's usually based on what they're talking about. So the level of research and time LeBron needs to invest in terms of preparing for a particular show is much, much lower. Much, 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 much lower. So from a tactical standpoint, the way LeBron is doing it is much smarter because it requires less of his time in terms of preparation. So he does it the best. But the other guys, my take on it, and they've had arguments about this. I've heard it on Gil's Arena. Some players are pro players having podcasts, other players against it. I don't want to hear from you throughout a regular season. I just don't. Like, I'm not really interested in hearing from you. What I'm interested is in how you're performing, because that's the very reason I'm actually following you. I'm not following you for your podcast. I'm following you for your production and your performances on a court. That's just my take on it, but that's just me. So the question to the audience is this: what do you think about players having podcasts, especially active players? Are you for it or are you against it? Whatever you guys think, please leave your thoughts and comments in the comment section, and we catch you guys on the next show. Peace.